Greetings.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just figured I'd eavesdrop a little bit on this call, so.
Great. I'm going to give you a shout out, so I'm happy.
Okay. Hey, Nicholas. I'm also Nicholas with an H.
Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you too.
Hey, how's everyone doing?
You good?
Awesome.
T-minus 2 days for a 10-day vacation, so I'm doing.
Oh, that's a good place to be. Give it a couple more minutes here. Pretty sure Paul was coming today. We had a chat this morning. Let me make sure screen sharing works. I think it does. All right, give it one more minute. Usual 3 after, and then we can get started. Laura, you have today's agenda, it looks
I
like.
do.
It's very dark in this room.
Hey there.
Hey, other Kubernetes SIG Multicluster. We both have the same name.
Interesting.
Cool. All right, so it's 3 after. Welcome everyone to the, what day is it? Tuesday, November 15th, SIG Multicluster meeting. Laura, you have the agenda, so I will let you take it away.
Thanks. Okay. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about the MCS end-to-end tests, both like in terms of being a framework and some of the status and progress on it. And I think I'd like to remind everybody that the MCS end-to-end tests existing, quote unquote, and particular some tests that don't exist yet are one of the beta blockers for the MCS API. So that's why we're working on it in the first point. And then another point, which I'll bring up later today too in showcasing the demo, is that we would also like these to operate as conformance tests so that implementations can check to see that their implementation is conforming to our standards programmatically instead of cross-referencing 10,000 keps. So hopefully that also improves the life and lifestyle of MCS implementations around the globe. I'm going to shout out to him several times, but Nick Eberts in the call is contributing to the end-to-end tests, and I'm actually running on a branch of his right now for this demo. He's both working on the tests that we're missing and dealing with the fallout of these tests not being updated through many changes to Kubernetes since they were last touched. So thank you for helping identify some of the, flags in kubectl that have been deprecated that the bash scripts need to be updated, or just other things, especially regarding dependent API versions that we need to update here. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so fundamentally, what I want to get across the most is that let's make these more beautiful right now, is that if you want to run the end-to-end tests, there's kind of two variations here that I'm going to show you. One is to run them against kind clusters that are running the sort of demo implementation of the MCS controller that's in the MCS API repo. And then there's the idea of running it against your implementation or implementation of interest. So for the first point, there are two relevant shell scripts I want to show you in here. So one is this one, E2E test, which itself will call this other script called up, which I'll show you in a second, which fundamentally creates two kind clusters that will be installed with the demo implementation of MCS that's in this repo, and then go test the E2E test package. So over here in up, there's some stuff in here, and here I've commented this out, but under normal circumstances, here we go. It will create this cluster, do some other setup to your local environment, connect the two clusters together so that they have a flat network, set up some RBAC, the service account for the MCS API controller, and actually deploy the MCS API controller in both clusters. So that's what this up.sh is doing. For people who have gone into this MCS API repo before, you'll recognize this and also recognize it as part of the demo scripts as well. So this whole thing that's trying to set up your kind clusters for you with the demo implementation of MCS is itself called in this E2E test.sh, which you could just like run this all together if you have no kind clusters and you're ready to go. I already have my kind clusters set up in here, and I have two kube configs that are referencing them, my C1 kube config and my C2 kube config. And I'm setting these as these variables, kube config 1 and kube config 2, because these will be used by the E2E test package to determine who's cluster 1 and who's cluster 2. So let me pop over there really quick, just to show you that in this E2E test package, there's these two files. E2E suite test.go is kind of where the setup. This is the input point for this package. And here you can see that it's going to grab that kube config 1 and kube config 2 environment variables, and that's how it's going to decide whose cluster we're working on. So I'm going to go ahead and go test this E2E package and verbose. There we go. So again, this is in against these two kind clusters. So I mentioned that Nick is helping discover several changes that we need to make to come into the 21st century, aka be more compliant with newer versions of Kubernetes. So for example, the end-to-end tests are working against the V1 beta and API for endpoint slice, but that's an example of something we need to update in the tests because past 124, it's V1. But yeah, so this will kind of run for a little while here, and then we'll see kind of like our classic Go test output. Yeah, so here, all of this I have been mentioning about how you could either start from up.sh or the whole wrapper E2E test.sh to both provision your kind clusters and run the end-to-end tests. Or you can set your kube config if you already have your kind clusters set up. If you have some other clusters that aren't kind clusters that you would like to run these end-to-end tests against, same idea, you can use these kube config environment variables to configure how what clusters your end-to-end tests are running against. So I'm going to come over here and show you the thrill of how non-compliant GKE MCS is right now, because I have some GKE clusters already running that have MCS configured, and I have them in these two kube configs, but you'll see if I run the end-to-end tests against here, eventually, what? Oh, it's cached. I see. There we go. Eventually it will get all mad because it's like, I don't know where service imports.multicluster.xk8.io is. And that's because GKE is running a mirror of the service import and service export CRDs that's in a different API group. So already GKE is showcasing its non-compliance here against what we want to use as our conformance test. But this is more to show you that if you have, any other arbitrary kube config environment variable set and you run these E2E tests against it, if it's a, MCS controller, if any MCS controller implementation is configured against those clusters, then the ideal situation is that these tests all pass, showcasing that your implementation that you're testing against is conformant. Great. So that is kind of the general gist I wanted to get across. A little bit more, maybe like a really brief dive again into these two files. I already mentioned it a little bit, but inside this ET test package, we have this file ET suite test go that is going to basically, parse some flags or environment variables and then call the tests that are over in this connectivity test.go file. So here's where, again, I'm on Nick's branch here. So it's recently been updated with more requirements that were missing for test 1. But, it's a lot of manifest looking stuff here in the beginning, but fundamentally the way that the test works is that there's some service that will be deployed in one cluster that is backed by this hello deployment over here. And scrolling down some more, in the other cluster, later on, we're going to deploy this request pod that's going to try and request from that deployment in the first cluster. And on this branch, it's on both the master right now and on this branch right now, they're configured to have the the hello deployment in the first cluster to like output some information and the request pod to parse that response to make sure it's what we expect. In the master branch right now, what that is the hello deployment literally outputs a string that says hello, and the request deployment makes sure that the response says hello. The improvement that Nick has on this branch is that the hello deployment, aka the thing in the exporting cluster, will report its pod IP, and the requester side will receive that pod IP, and then the test will check to make sure that only the pod IPs that we expect, aka the expected endpoints, were the ones that responded. So that's one of the specific updates that are in this branch that are part of making our MCS API ET tests compliant with how the KEP is defined. So everything down here, there's a lot of sort of boilerplate setup to create a namespace that's dedicated just to this conformance test and set up in both cluster 1 and cluster 2. Everything that is necessary, at least in terms of namespaces in both, and then our hello deployment in the exporting cluster, which in this case is cluster 2. And then way down here somewhere, after all of that setup, there are these two checks for UDP and TCP to actually connect across these clusters. It requests the VIP, the cluster set IP, and then, as mentioned, it's going to confirm that the responses that came from pods that responded to that cluster set IP are all the pod IPs that we expect. So that's what's going on in here. So that's what I wanted to showcase. There's still some more tests to implement. And then, as mentioned, there's some fixes to just generally the end-to-end test to be more hip with the new versions of Kubernetes. So definitely open to dividing and conquering more of this work if you're interested. But also want to just double click on that shout out to Nick for taking a stab at it and helping improve the tests and get closer to our MCS beta, long awaited MCS beta status. Yeah.
Awesome.
That's the
Yeah,
show.
thanks for the demo. Thanks, Laura and Nick. Really nice to see that.
Yeah, and I think if other folks here are representing their MCS implementation, your usage of these conformance tests, and also if you see like any major issues in them, would be super helpful as well. So if you have some time and have, you know, some clusters running your implementation of MCS lying around, and can run these end-to-end tests against them, that would be awesome. And either open an issue against it or, you know, send a message in the Slack if there's some glaring issue that you're into. One of the Kubernetes SIG multiclusters has risen their hand.
It's me.
Hi.
I'm the one that raised my hand.
Nice.
Okay, so I'm really glad to see, you know, like the E2E development continuing. I think that if the only thing standing between conformance or GKE's MCS implementation and conformance is the API group name, then I would love for this test suite to be able to show people that. You know, and I believe the reason for the difference in API group is around GKE's policy on which APIs they expose to users and what their versions are. So,
Right.
you know, I think that is a valid strategy that a vendor may want to do. It's just the group name, right? The resources aren't named differently.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I definitely agree that if this was a little bit more resilient to being able to report more information without freaking out about the API group, that may be helpful. I mean, obviously it's helpful for GKE, but it might be helpful for, you know, other upcoming or other vendor specific implementations. So
Gotcha.
yeah, I think we can, I definitely think we can open an issue about that and figure out how we want to proceed down there. I mean, right now, the reason it's throwing this is because it's trying to query the API as written in the MCS API, like the type that is actually in this repo. So I think we'll need to, you know, do something to make that more resilient without having to like make a mirror of everybody else's like API group, I guess. So yeah, but yeah, I 100% agree with you.
I think you can probably contrive a way to do it with the unstructured client, but I doubt there is a way to get any typed client generated off of those CRDs to be coerced into using a different API group.
Gotcha. The other Kubernetes SIG multicluster has raised their hand.
The worst one. Yeah, so I think that makes sense. I actually wonder if we shouldn't just parameterize GVR entirely, the group version resource, because
Okay.
I'm just thinking too, like if we had a V2, which hopefully we won't. But if we did,
Mhm.
or as we progress through, it might be useful to be able to say which version you're testing against.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it probably needs to use unstructured because yeah, I don't know how we'd get anything else generated nicely.
Yeah, I mean, maybe people who have more experience with version, like not deprecations, but version upgrades over time, like even the point of that these tests were originally written against like endpoint slice v1 beta, and like I guess the alpha version of MCS, or they're not in KK together, so like that is still optional CRD, and this controller did work against clusters at a time that were in beta. So I think I would like to know from the chairs if it's valuable for these E2E tests from a conformance perspective to still be like back compatible to a certain version of Kubernetes.
I would think that generally we want to be as back compatible as possible, because one of the benefits to doing this was out of tree was to not be tied to like version releases, but I don't think we necessarily need to go out of our way to support things that like have been deprecated for like a long period of time. So, you know, we definitely shouldn't like, we shouldn't cut corners if we can avoid it. But and I'd like to support far back, but let's not go crazy here. I think if a version has been in the wild for like a year or more,
yeah, that's a
probably
good
okay.
temperature check.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much on the same page. Do remember that the EDE binary itself can be released and versioned coincidental with the spec. So I think there's two different axes in what we've talked about, right? Like one is a time, like forward backward axis, and another is a like productization or vendor behavior type of axis. And I think where my priority is like I would want to make sure that the EDE is a useful tool to vendors, saying at this point in time, how close to conformance is your implementation? And in time, as we move forward, we can cut versions of that. But I'm less worried, for example, in being backward compatible back to like endpoint slice, which is relatively ancient in the lifetime of MCS, right? So I think that's where I stand.
Yeah, I think the nuance here is that the like the version skew is not from the MCS API. The version skew and the end-to-end test is not from the MCS API, but something in core. And
okay.
Yeah, it's because it's endpoint slice. And then, but I do agree that conformance tests themselves don't need, like, implementations are of course free, but particularly because we chose to implement this out of tree to be backwards compatible through many variations of endpoint slice or any other dependent API through in the past, as long as CRDs were part of Kubernetes, for as long as CRDs were part of Kubernetes. But I do think there's a lower bar for backwards compatibility against what Kubernetes clusters you'll test against for end-to-end conformance.
Yeah, so I think the problem that we're describing is what is the minimum Kubernetes version requirement of any cluster you'll use to test your implementation against, right?
Yeah, yes, that is the fundamental question.
Yeah, so we should probably think about, do we want to encode into the spec itself what that minimum version is and derive the testing requirement off of the spec, ideally? That makes sense?
Yeah, like against the version of the MCS API.
Right. So if I remember correctly, currently the spec for the MCS API itself
Mhm.
doesn't declare a minimum supported version of Kubernetes, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
No.
Okay. So we should think about whether it should.
Mhm.
And I think it probably would be wise to do that. You know, for example, there is a natural one that's included, right? Like you wouldn't be able to run any MCS implementation in a version of Kubernetes that didn't have all of the CRD features
Yeah,
that are required, right?
Yeah.
So
I think
there
that's
is
like
a
118
natural
or
minimum
something.
supported
Yeah,
version. Yep.
yeah.
Mhm. So we should be thinking about, like, what are those limits of the implementation that are so important that they have to be in the spec, probably, to start with. And then we can be thinking about, like, which is there another aspect of that we want to surface, like, additionally into the EDEs. I think it would make sense.
Yeah.
But what to just be explicit, like, what I mean by that is, like, I think it would make sense for the EDE to check the version endpoint of the cluster and say, if you're trying to run against a 1.7 cluster, at a minimum, this probably won't work. But if there are other attributes of the way that the tests are written that are going to affect the, like, that are going to be affected by the details of the control plane, we should think about how to surface those additionally.
Yeah.
EOF.
Cool. Great. I'm taking some notes.
Yeah, I would look at, like, I think all of that is a really good point. To me, to also save effort, I think endpoint slice is the newest dependency. And while GKE also works with endpoints, I don't know that we want to have to deal with that for conformance.
Right.
And 121 is certainly mature at this point, and that's the endpoint slice stable, I believe. So, you know, yeah, when figuring this out, I think that would be reasonable. Like, go ahead and implement something that supports older versions for sure. And I think, you know, a few of the implementations do. But in terms of conformance, like, you know, that's still significantly mature at this point, for us to call that a baseline, given that MCS is not yet a GA API. I think that to me feels reasonable in terms of back compatibility.
Okay, great. I will proceed with 121 as the expected cutoff, since our freshest dependency was V1 then, and it's quite mature. And we'll also look into encoding the minimum version required into the MCS API, though that may still be as far as 118, or we could decide something somewhere in the middle, or we could decide it's also 121, but I'm not sure that we want to do that. I don't get the sense that we want to do that. And then the other takeaway was we're cool with parameterizing the API group. And you gave some ideas of how to do that, or even just the entire resource version too, in case we need to support multiple versions of even the MCS API in the future with these tests. Great. Thanks for the feedback.
I think that covers it.
Yeah. Cool. Well, again, help is always appreciated. And holler at me if you want to get involved.
Thank you, Laura.
Totes. Thank you, Nick. Back
Thank
to
you,
back
Nick.
to back to thank you on Nick.
Listen, I could do very little, but I'm glad that what little I can do can be helpful.
Yeah, it's very impactful. So
Thank you for
Yeah,
making
thanks
me-
a lot. All right.
all right, I cede my time.
That I believe that is our agenda for today. So unless anyone has anything else they want to add. All right. Well, thank you all. Have an excellent Tuesday. Oh, wait, Paul.
So
Paul Pink. Yeah.
Jeremy, let's talk about KubeFed. So Jeremy and I, we've had like an open item that we've needed to follow up with the group on. And here's what I think Jeremy and I are aligned on doing is let's give it 6 weeks from today. And at the end of that 6 weeks, we'll cut a tombstone commit for KubeFed and we'll archive the repo. As we've said before, the archival is not deletion. People can work with that code, they can use it, etc. But the figure that we have in mind to bring this thread on deprecation to a close is that we'll do that at the end of 6 weeks from today, I think is what we discussed, right, Jeremy?
Yeah, and I'll draft email and send that out to the group today to start the 6-week clock. And reminder, KubeFed it's archived, but it's not deleted. Anyone who wants to use it still can. Fork it, run with it as you will. But the official SIGs repo will be gone. Or archived, not gone, sorry.
Great. UF.
All right. Now with that, now we're actually done. So thanks everyone. Have a great Tuesday. We'll see you in a couple weeks.
See you, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good day.